The first Mass Effect is one of the best RPGs ever made. It spawned one of the most important and impactful franchises in the entire industry. It was also just an excellent work of science fiction, with a unique blend of ideas, aesthetics, and gameplay innovations that still manages to feel fresh today. If it wasn't so gripping and engaging, I wouldn't be joining the legion of YouTube nobodies making video essays about it, and there is a lot to discuss. However, it's difficult to talk about said franchise and its uncertain future without also discussing its many disappointments. There was the third game's controversial ending. And then there was Andromeda. Dear God, Andromeda. It's difficult to talk about the series because it is, frankly speaking, a schizophrenic mess. Yet BioWare's recent release of the Legendary Edition breathed some new life into the franchise, as they accompanied the remaster with a potential sequel tease. Despite all the fuck-ups, Mass Effect is still around. Mostly because it makes so much goddamn money that it's impossible for EA to leave it alone. And, despite all the disappointments, we still want more. So, whether in 2 years or 10, we'll be getting a new Mass Effect game. What will it look like? BioWare isn't the company it once was. The gaming industry has changed. The fans are older, expectations are different. After a disastrous conclusion and an aborted reboot, there's no clear direction for the series. Where do we go from here? Well, the original trilogy has been discussed, analyzed, and critiqued to death. Even if I wanted to, there's nothing substantive I could add to those conversations. Instead, I'm gonna do something a little different. Hi, my name's Gunmetal Stug. I make high-effort shitposts. This video is one of them. A long, rambling, and self-indulgent attempt at examining what made Mass Effect special. How we might get a sequel that elevates what worked in the series while improving the franchise overall. How we can move forward with Mass Effect. But, I hear you ask, why do you care? Why should I care? What's the point of all this? Well, I'll tell you. Mass Effect is fucking awesome. Besides an unhealthy personal adoration of the series, the trilogy was a watershed event that changed the entire gaming industry, with its elements and conventions rippling across nearly every genre and platform. Alex Kurtzman even plagiarized it for national television. However, Andromeda came out 5 years after the trilogy's conclusion, and boy was it, well...
My face is tired from dealing with everything.
I don't use this dead meme carelessly. Allison's mushy oatmeal face and eyes with all the liveliness of a dead fish sums up Andromeda perfectly. The game was mediocre, underwritten, undercooked, and just in the right mixture to become a laughingstock. After a thoroughly middling reception, Andromeda's single-player DLC was postponed indefinitely mere months after release. Some mourned the game's early death, but most people's faces were too tired. With Andromeda's 5 years of troubled development, its premature release, and whatever the fuck happened with Anthem, BioWare is on EA's blood-soaked chopping block. Despite the successes of the Legendary Edition and the sequel tease, I'm not taking its eventual release for granted. So in spite of this, with a healthy overvaluation of my own opinion, a dash of narcissism, no experience in game development, and a critical eye that blows past pretentious and into nitpicking fuckwit, let's discuss what this upcoming project can do to bring home the bacon. I'll admit outright that I know virtually nothing about how AAA games are developed or what internal pressures a studio might face. A lot of what follows will come off as armchair game design, because that's exactly what it is, and isn't intended to be taken as holy writ. I'm basically flicking uncooked idea pasta at the vast, uncaring wall that is the internet in hopes that something sticks. I'm also quite new at this whole video essay thing, so your patience is appreciated. But not compulsory. I've included timecodes in the video description to make this enormous rant more easily digestible. If you find yourself getting bored or my shrill voice is boring into your brain pan, skip ahead, or close the video. I'm a recording, not a cop. It should also be stated that if you haven't played the Mass Effect games, not only will this video be extremely confusing, but it will also be loaded with spoilers. Granted, the games came out a decade ago, so if you haven't been spoiled yet, color me impressed. Also, go check out the Legendary Edition. All done with that 120 hours of content? Great, let's get started. First off, I'm going to talk about why Mass Effect 1 stands out, why it's still regarded as a classic so many years later, and a bit about why the expectations it set were squandered by the sequels. For the sake of time, I'll be heavily cribbing from Seamus Young's Mass Effect retrospective, with his permission, of course. It's a fantastic read, and I highly recommend that you check it out. In fact, he's recently refined, expanded, and published it as Mess Effect, a astounding 195,000-word thesis on how the franchise imploded. There's links to both the original retrospective and Mass Effect in the description. He also released an excellent video that summarizes his most important points, which you should probably be watching instead of this. Over the course of, He examines the series with a fine-tooth comb, discussing what worked, what didn't, and why Mass Effect 3's ending was not 10 terrible minutes that ruined a trilogy, but rather the final thread that, when yanked, unraveled the entire series. Whatever. However, considering the time investment all that requires, and to make my own derivative essay somewhat more coherent and not dependent on outside knowledge, I'll summarize the most salient point of Seamus Young's analysis and explain why it's critical to consider. Mass Effect 1 is a details-first space opera, with a knowledge quest at its core, and none of the sequels were germane to that unique narrative thrust. Let me unpack that. Details-first stories invest precious screen time into establishing the specific technical details and limitations of their worlds. This effort doesn't just enhance the narrative with interesting background lore, but it often drives the story being told. Mass Effect 1's Milky Way is one such lovingly crafted and carefully considered fictional universe. Seamus has a video about this too. Nearly everything the Codex has to say is important and factors into the plot somehow, whether or not the player bothers to read it. However, Mass Effect 2 changed the entire tone, style, and presentation of the franchise into a drama-first narrative, that is, a story that prioritizes emotional beats and plot progression over establishing a cohesive diegetic history, or including extensive technical discussions. Despite my obvious preference, this is not a bad or wrong way to write a story, but serious problems arise when you attempt to mash these two types of storytelling together, because they're literally antithetical. By beginning as details first and hard shifting into drama first, the series' narrative eschewed logical progression and verisimilitude in order to function, while discarding or retconning nitty-gritty technical minutiae as needed. This was a jarring change that hollowed out the core of the first game's appeal. It also exploded the narrative into an incoherent cloud of meaningless noise that's impossible to care about or take seriously. Total story collapse. If you'd like a more recent example of such a collapse occurring, or I've lost you and you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, compare the details first Season 1 of Game of Thrones to the drama first Season 8.
While Danny kind of forgot.
Things just started happening without rhyme, reason, or warning. Characters took whatever action would make the biggest, most shocking scene, not what was consistent with their arcs, their world, or even common fucking sense. As a result, you stopped caring. But in Mass Effect, this didn't happen over 8 seasons. It happened in one scene. It didn't help that Mass Effect 2's story was terrible. I know the popular opinion is that it's the Empire Strikes Back of the trilogy, but its strength was never in the overarching narrative, but rather the characters that filled it. Once you start dissecting the actual plot, it boggles the mind how quickly poor writing choices pile up. In reality, Mass Effect 3's ending wasn't the point of no return. It was this. Another disappointment that Seamus lightly discusses, but is excellently elaborated upon in Racevik's video essay retrospectives, is that we never got the details first vision of Mass Effect 1 rendered with the level of fidelity and craft its sequels received. Mass Effect is a series that was never truly realized. It never had that perfect game, and it never found its footing. It started as a BioWare-styled RPG with excellent writing and some uneven surrounding systems. It underwent a violent metamorphosis into a drama-first action RPG with writing.
He's a hero, a bloody icon.
Its third iteration was the thing that happened. Andromeda also failed to realize the first game's promise for reasons that are eminently obvious. Every game tried to live up to Mass Effect 1 in some way, but none of them succeeded. That's not the only thing the retrospective discusses. It's not even close. Seamus makes even more excellent points that I'll reference. So many that I'll throw this watermark on screen whenever I mention something he examines more thoroughly. Although it should be noted I don't agree with everything he says. So, why do I care so much about Mass Effect if I've fallen out of love with its sequels? Well, allow me to lecture you about what details first really means, and why the first game is so goddamn great despite its flaws. It would be easy and pithy to just say, because the writing was good, and leave it at that, but the answer is far more in-depth, and the writing in the later games wasn't uniformly terrible. Mass Effect 1 was well written, but it also respected your time, intelligence, and agency with its deliberative lore and storytelling, and there's nothing RPG nerds love more than quality world building. It rewarded players who poked around the Citadel, perused the Codex, did side quests, talked to NPCs, investigated. You learned about the people that inhabited this world, how they think, what they believe, and what's important to them. They had opinions of their own and came into conflict with each other. And all of this affects the story at hand. Unlike the sequels, the universe did not revolve around Shepard, humanity, and Earth. In fact, making humans galactic newcomers and underdogs amongst a federation of aliens was one of the most captivating decisions the writers made. Besides being relatively novel in a sci-fi universe, and extremely unique for a video game, it also did a lot of unspoken storytelling. Stopping Saren wasn't just Shepard's personal quest, it was humanity's quest by proxy, a chance to prove themselves and secure a future in a large, dangerous, and unforgiving galaxy. Shepard being made a Spectre is a huge deal, and the fact that the later game dropped this angle entirely in order to put humanity at the forefront and make Shepard bionic space Jesus was not only disappointing, but turned the narrative into a confused, contradictory clusterfuck. Shepard's position at the beginning of Mass Effect 1 gave the story a great deal of momentum and personal stakes without directly slapping the player's nose and screaming, "You need to care about this!" Mass Effect 1's degree of thought and care extends to every aspect of the story. The first mission effortlessly inspires dread and mystery. It was even smart enough to let you chat with some of your crew members before you hopped in your spacesuit to kick some ass. True, you might not have cared over much when Jenkins gets fucking murked, but his presence still taught you about the universe you just entered. These crew members give you context and a reason to care about what's happening. And once you land on Eden Prime, it's immediately made clear how out of depth humanity is. The shot of Sovereign looming over the colony puts in narrative legwork that's later paid off on Vermeer, so when you learn what's really going on, you buy every word.
Rudimentary creatures of blood and flesh. You touch my mind, fumbling in ignorance, incapable of understanding.
The reason this reveal works is because, all of a sudden, everything makes sense. The more you investigate it, the more shocking and terrible the reveal. The staggering amount of foreshadowing is finally paid off, and Sovereign's lines are some of the most dread-inducing stuff ever put in a video game. Not only because Sovereign is threatening galactic extinction, but because you immediately understand that it doesn't give a shit about Shepard. The Reapers are all powerful, and they're coming. Contrast this with the sequel. Both Sovereign and Harbinger called Shepard and pals worthless. Let's see what this looks like between the two Reapers.
Before us, you are nothing. Your extinction is inevitable. We are the end of everything.
Shepard, you have become an annoyance. You fight against inevitability, dust struggling against cosmic winds.
Yeah. Sovereign remains one of the most threatening and imposing video game villains of all time, and Harbinger is a meme. I'm not making this comparison just to rip on Mass Effect 2. This one reveal was the setup for the entire story. The Reapers are invincible, they are inevitable, they cannot be conquered by conventional means, and 3 dudes in power armor can't save galactic civilization with guns, pluck, and a healthy number of chest-high walls. The overarching story of Mass Effect was intended to be a knowledge quest, and instead it became something else. In the first game, you learn about Saren's goals, learn about the Protheans, then learn the true scope of the threat. By doing so, you learn more about the world, about the state of the galaxy, about its history and its cultures. And in learning, the game makes you care. Speaking of intertwining learning and caring, let's talk about companions, who not only invest you in their personal stories, but also do some heavy lifting when it comes to world building. Part of what makes Mass Effect 1 so good is that the writers understood that vomiting lore at people results in the player either not caring about the story at hand, or actively resenting attempts to immerse them. That's the #1 rule of creative writing. Show, don't tell. While there's lots of telling, it's done in an intelligent way, through your companions. Besides being fun characters, they doubled as insights into the history, aliens, and themes presented in Mass Effect's Milky Way. Tali taught the player about Quarians, their rite of pilgrimage, what life is like on the migrant fleet, how Quarians are treated by society at large, as well as providing a unique perspective on the Geth threat. On the surface, Rex behaved like a stereotypical Krogan, but his sharp mind and mournful consideration of his species showed the player that they weren't all mindless brutes, which also subconsciously made the Krogan rebellion believable. Garrus' conflict between his pursuit of justice and experiences with C-Sec not only illustrated typical Turian sensibilities and Garrus' difficulty with them, but also C-Sec itself, life on the Citadel, the ethics of Spectres, and the bureaucratic obstructionism that pervades Council government. I could go on, there's a wealth of great characters, but the point is made. Not only did these characters present some exposition about the Milky Way, they gave the universe texture and depth. By pursuing their character arcs, you learned more about the world of Mass Effect and grew to care about the people that live there. I'll be fair to the later entries in the series here and say that this is one of the few things they carried forward from the first game. Mass Effect 2 introduced even more interesting and arresting characters while further developing the ones we already knew. Except for Liara, what the fuck were they thinking? Mass Effect 3 was a little emotionally manipulative in this regard, but even Mass Effect Andromeda had some standout characters. Mass Effect 1, however, treated them differently. They weren't just window dressing or exposition dispensers or throwaway romance options. They were an integral part of the narrative, the world being presented. Tying this all together was the dialogue wheel. Here, BioWare wore its heritage on its sleeve. The dialogue wheel was a cinematic evolution of their older games, where dialogue choices were selected from a very dry and unsexy box, with no more than a bloop letting you know that a choice had been made. But not Mass Effect. You picked a quick summation of what you wanted to say, then Shepard delivered it with every inch of conviction the voice actors had.
Because it's a big stupid jellyfish.
God bless Mark Meer and Jennifer Hale. The system had its flaws, which have been covered exhaustively by now, see both the retrospective and Race Civics videos, but the effect this had on the game cannot be understated. By introducing this system, BioWare made sure that you felt like a part of the Milky Way, that you weren't some kleptomaniac stealth archer, grand wizard, master assassin, chosen one, who was also a vampire, but an actual character that existed within the world they were presenting. The key to all of this was options. In the first game, investigative dialogue trees were usually twice as long as core dialogues, which could also open new lines of inquiry that you could explore, and were free to do so at your leisure. The more you investigated, the better equipped you were to make choices, and the more payoff you earned for yourself later in the story. However, the dialogue wheel became more and more binary as the series progressed, and in Mass Effect 3, the number of investigative dialogue trees could virtually be counted on one hand. And what made the first game special was its investigative nature, its details-first world building, its care and consideration not only for the story, but the player that was experiencing it. I'll say it again because it bears repeating. Mass Effect 1 respects your time, intelligence, and agency. Its sequels, not so much. This section will be brief because I don't want to rag on the Mass Effect sequels too much. There's enough criticism out there that will last you until the actual day Saren launches his attack on Eden Prime, and there's not much I can add here that you haven't heard before, but I'll cover the important parts to help illustrate my points. I also don't want to give you the impression that I completely hated the sequels, or that Mass Effect 1 was some peerless masterclass experience that can't be criticized because, boy, did it have some issues. Besides the uncharted worlds, which looked like they were built by Slardar on methamphetamines and were traversed by a Mako that controlled like a played-out simile, there were a host of other problems. Awkward combat, a god-awful loot system, occasional subpar environment design, presentation issues, etc.
I can bludgeon pretty hard.
While the Legendary Edition did a lot to smooth out these issues and greatly update its visuals, the game's core still has these underlying layers of jank. The Mass Effect sequels unilaterally improved visuals, combat, and moment-to-moment gameplay, but they failed to capitalize on what made Mass Effect 1 so strong in the first place. Mostly. I'm being unfair to Mass Effect 2 here by omitting the fact that its aforementioned character work takes up a generous majority of the game. It's legitimately good. Great. Iconic even. It's so good, however, that it tricks your brain into forgetting that all these fantastic characters are bolted onto a desultory plot that doesn't technically require their involvement. These character stories, which contain the best writing in the game, are ultimately ancillary to Mass Effect 1's central narrative thrust. They're wonderful, but building a team is not a complete story. It's a plot component, part of a greater whole. And that greater whole sucks.
Hey, phrasing!
I guarantee that when you ask a fan what their favorite part of Mass Effect 2 was, they sure as shit won't mention Harbinger, the Collectors, or fucking Cerberus. But these are the elements that drive Mass Effect 2's narrative, yet they have nothing to do with, or actively contradict, previously established material. Even before the dreaded C word is spoken, however, the promise of Mass Effect 1 is broken in the first scene. It's flashy, dramatic trailer bait with all the substance of a communion wafer. Shepard's death and immediate resurrection broke the narrative over its knee like it was fucking Bane dunking on Batman. In the first 10 minutes, Mass Effect 2 managed to discard everything important to Mass Effect 1. The quest for knowledge regarding the Reapers and finding a way to defeat them grinds to a screeching halt, only to suddenly focus on working for third-rate Bond villain-level terrorists in an attempt to stop aliens we've never seen before from abducting colonists we'd never meet or care about, and shouldn't even be in danger in the first place. Shepard is turned into a bionic badass and the savior of humanity, instead of an exceptional soldier and leader that was a small but strong fish in a massive galactic pond. I could go on, but you get the point. When I say the sequels failed to live up to Mass Effect 1, I mean that their quality, worthwhile content was either disconnected from the larger plot or composed of payoffs from narrative threads, themes, and characters that were established in the first game. For me, the first game is a flawed masterpiece, but one that was infinitely more interesting and engaging than its follow-ups. There aren't many details-first games that receive such a level of craft and fidelity, and even fewer that take place in such an interesting science fiction setting. It's really no wonder Mass Effect exploded in popularity. Personally, I would love to see this theoretical new sequel take the presentation and tighter gameplay of the later titles and weld it to the details-first storytelling of Mass Effect 1. I don't want to make it sound like this is some slam dunk affair. Making a modern AAA title is an expensive and exhaustive process, and dishing out criticisms a decade after the fact might be cathartic, but it's not constructive. I also think it's reductive to claim that BioWare is dead. Sorry, Seamus-senpai, but I think this is being a bit dramatic. While BioWare hasn't made a banger in a long while, I do think that some dedicated leadership and invested writers could turn things around. With an extensive pre-production phase, strong design document, and a cohesive, focused development cycle, we'd get something truly special. I know that's much easier said than done, but honestly, the alternative is too depressing to consider. It's a big ask, but I'm going to try and be positive and finally get to the point of this video. How this theoretical Mass Effect 5 can recapture the magic. How we can put the sour taste of the multicolored endings and the bland yet bitter oatmeal of Andromeda behind us. So, where do we even begin? Unfortunately, Andromeda failed. Given the massive EA stamp polonium round in the back of its head, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the chances of future Andromeda titles are low. They're not zero, but they're low. Andromeda was dead on arrival, and the Helios cluster wasn't really interesting enough to sustain a sequel. To me, some fucking rando on the internet, it doesn't make sense to set another game there after the vast majority of the player base shrugged their shoulders and never bothered with Andromeda again. A quality Andromeda sequel is by no means an impossible task, but one that is definitely, as Wesley Snipes would put it, ice skating uphill. I believe we need to start over. Again. But where if Andromeda was a dud? It's pretty obvious. Right back where we started. The Milky Way. Judging by the teaser BioWare released, it looks like they agree with me. I'm glad to see it, even though I have a few concerns. But first, let's have a quick chat about why this is the wiser choice. We can't really do a prequel. While it might be fun to do a First Contact War story, or something set during humanity's first years as part of a galactic society, the issue is context. Even if this theoretical prequel is the best Mass Effect game ever made, there will always be a lingering butt in the back of players' minds. A very large, crustacean-shaped butt. And its name is the Reapers. Any decisions made during this prequel will always come with a tag that says, well, none of this matters because the Reapers are going to show up in a few years. Like a squadmate, chances they're either a husk or a glossy scorch mark in a decade. Save a planet, buy Mass Effect 3 times, it'll probably look like Australia. So we can't do a prequel, and I don't think doing something concurrent with Shepard's story is a great idea either, as that would likely involve lots of rehashing, retreading, and, again, the issue of context. Hence my concern with the teaser. I'm a little worried that BioWare will resort to member berries in order to try and win back the crowd. The story of Shepard, his friends, the Reapers, and the SSV daddy issues is definitively over. None of this essay is based around wanting the old crew back. I just want the kind of care they got. In order to capitalize on the details first presentation and wonderful storytelling of the first Mass Effect game, I believe a sequel to Shepard's story is the best path forward. Not a direct sequel, mind you, rather one that takes place in the aftermath of the Reaper War. But why, you ask again? Annoyingly, all the endings and everything attached to them are awful. How can you build a story out of them? Well, we have to talk about the ending of Mass Effect 3. Again, I feel like a broken record. This has been covered in extensive detail by other people, but for our purposes here, we need to establish that each of the three endings, Destroy, Control, and Synthesis, offer radically different futures for Mass Effect's Milky Way. So much so that it's literally impossible to make a sequel that could account for all of them. Public discourse about the ending seems to have concluded that Mass Effect 3 completely nuked the potential for a sequel in the Milky Way. Allow me to counter with this. No. Personally, I don't really care if BioWare chooses a canon ending. In fact, why does anyone care? If there's one thing nerds can agree on, it's that the ending of Mass Effect 3 was terrible. Just pick one of the endings and go with it. It might spawn a storm of furious tweets from basement dwellers when the decision is revealed, but someone's gonna get mad no matter what, so BioWare might as well commit. If your complaint is that BioWare choosing an ending at all violates the core premise of the series, I have really, really bad news for you. While I clearly have my own issues with the trilogy and a preferred ending, I think that the original trilogy stands well enough as its own thing. Hell, they're easy enough to mentally separate from Andromeda. I realize a sequel in the Milky Way wouldn't be such a clean break, but hand-waving the sequel as a game set in a version of the Mass Effect universe where Shepard made such and such decisions would literally take one statement or trailer acknowledging the canon choices made, and maybe a few lines as to why. Or just retcon everything. Fuck it, why not? There'd be the aforementioned whining and impotent frothing from bitter nerds, but I think that after Andromeda and what could be as much as 10 to 15 years between titles, fans would gnaw through a pile of dog shit if you told them there's a romanceable Quarian at the center, let alone a new Mass Effect game. But there's actually another reason why picking one of the endings would be a great way to move forward with the franchise. The endings, while bad themselves, are not actually the worst places to start a new story. Except Synthesis. Fuck Synthesis. The Reaper War was an apocalyptic event. The war, and by extension Shepard, are the most important things to happen in the galaxy since the Reapers were first created. And the war was not won quickly, but only in its very last moments when all other reasonable alternatives failed, and the most populous worlds were undergoing genocide on an unprecedented scale. In the extended cut ending slides, it was hand-waved just how devastating this war would have been. The body count would conservatively be estimated in the billions. Entire worlds were scoured, the mass relay network was broken, the Citadel was stripped of life and moved halfway around the galaxy. You get the idea. What's my point in all this? Well, as noted in many analyses of the ending, and frequently stressed by Seamus Young, people will still need to eat. And that kind of thing matters in details-first science fiction. No matter which color ending you pick, more people are gonna die before anything gets better. Lots more. And things are not gonna get better quickly. Simply put, the state of the Milky Way immediately following the Reaper War is fucking awful. And therein lies great story potential. A galaxy recovering from the brink of annihilation. So, if we're making a sequel, we have to solve the ending problem and pick one. And again, they could just retcon a lot of it, and that would be perfectly fine. Like, who cares? I mean, cosmically speaking, none of this matters that much. Where was I? Oh, right, picking an ending, because I can't infinitely speculate on what retcons would look like. To me, the choice is obvious. Destroy. Let me explain why. Control doesn't work because keeping the Reapers around makes solving the problems created by the Reapers too easy to fix. A massive legion of god robots under the control of a benevolent Shepard mind doesn't lend itself well to future stories or interesting developments. It also trivializes the mistakes of the Reaper War and its apocalyptic fallout, unless they fuck off to the Centaurus galaxy or something. It's not impossible to do, it'd just be an unnecessary pain in the ass to ride around. Synthesis is just a mess. Besides being the obviously author-preferred answer to a conflict that was charitably at the back of players' minds by the time of Mass Effect 3's climax, a galaxy where synthetic and organic life have been flawlessly merged changes the entire fabric of consciousness and existence within the Milky Way. It radically, fundamentally alters the kind of stories that can be told within it. Synthesis is also just straight-up space magic bullshit, which, as it should come as no surprise, rubs me the wrong way. Sure, Mass Effect was a far cry from hard science fiction, but it never strayed into anything of this magnitude. It also goes without saying, though since I clearly love the sound of my own voice, I'll say it anyway, no Mass Effect sequel can happen in a universe where Shepard chose synthesis. That leaves Destroy. Destroy isn't a perfect solution, but it's the best one we got if we want to stay in the Milky Way. Choosing Destroy, Shepard wipes the Reapers from the galaxy. The war is over, but its effects are massive and all-encompassing. By destroying both the Reapers and the Geth, Shepard also ensured that recovery will be a long and difficult process. It's not the best ending, but it is the most interesting. To be clear, in order to divorce itself from the endings without too much whiplash, the specifics of the Reaper War, especially details regarding the ending, should be glossed over or infrequently mentioned during the course of any new game, with the exceptions of Shepard's choices surrounding the war, because they're the ones we actually made and cared about. So let's start here, with Destroy. After a long and brutal battle against extinction, the denizens of the Milky Way are left shocked, bewildered, and shattered. As the Reapers topple across the galaxy, many start to wonder how it happened. It swiftly becomes irrelevant as they realize the Mass Effect relays have been disrupted. As many fans theorized after the ending's initial release, starvation begins to set in as stranded fleets and colonies struggle to support themselves. The fleet above Earth recovers relatively quickly, given their high concentration of ships, skilled technicians, and access to the ruins of the Citadel. The story is not so good across the galaxy. As casualties continue to mount well after the Reapers fall, people start asking questions. How could we let this happen? Why didn't we listen to Shepard? What happens now? To me, this is a pretty solid framework for a sequel in the Milky Way. Let me slip even further into fanfiction mode for a second and show you a version of what this might look like. So, civilization has only just begun to find its legs again. The most critical relay lines have been re-established, but the majority of systems are still closed off and isolated. A narrative has sprung up regarding the Reaper War. Shepard warned us. We didn't listen. During the battle for Earth, he disappeared, and then the Reapers died. No one knows precisely what happened, but now that society is somewhat back on its feet, people are starting to point fingers. Besides the mass relays, massive swaths of infrastructure were destroyed. Agricultural hubs, space stations, factories, cities, orbital dockyards, etc. They've been obliterated, casually destroyed by the Reapers as they marched across the galaxy. The impact this has on civilization is enormous. For context, imagine America. Now imagine if all of its major highways vanished overnight. Oh, and the Midwest burned down, and also the East Coast. In the chaos, lawlessness and piracy are rife. With the Council still consolidating years after the war, bands of desperate, traumatized veterans have been preying on whoever they can in order to survive. Racial tensions are high. Despite Shepard's work to bring us all together, our baser natures are getting in the way. The Krogan have a cure for the genophage, and many eye them warily. Even though Rex has established an embassy and hopes to make the Krogan a council race, many are hesitant to see this happen, for obvious reasons. The Quarians have their homeworld back, but are struggling to keep their dwindling population alive. The migrant fleet was relying on established planets to help sustain them, and those are... yeah. Their peace with the Geth, as brokered by Shepard, was short-lived and tragic. Other races fear that they'll resurrect the Geth in an attempt to secure their future. Humanity is in a difficult position, having lost their homeworld to a massive Reaper invasion. As a younger species, they never had the opportunity to spread their population out across their colonies, meaning that humanity has been drastically depopulated. Earth was ultimately saved, but it'll be at least a century before it's back to anything resembling normal. The Asari and Turians are also hard hit, and must rely on their colonies for support and sustenance. Although their species suffered less due to their dispersed populace, the Turians are no longer the linchpin of defense for the Citadel, while the Asari's war contributions were too little and too late. They've lost a lot of standing in political capital. The Solarians are the least affected race. Their homeworld was never attacked by the Reapers, and for a reason that's never adequately answered, they withheld the bulk of their fleets from the desperate Hail Mary attack that won the war. As a result, they suffer an intense amount of scrutiny, and many question where their loyalties lay during the war. All this tension and conflict might sound out of place in the immediate aftermath of the Reaper War, but stick with me for a second. Human, and by extension alien nature, is not something that can be overridden by jumping into a giant green beam, goddammit. Mass Effect's Milky Way was never presented as an idyllic place, no matter what opening title crawls would have you believe. Even with an existential threat that was soundly defeated, there's still thousands of pieces to pick up. No one ever said Warsaw was a great place to live in the 40s, but this is on another scale entirely. Billions are dead as a result of the Reaper War. Trauma, infighting, unrest, and tribalism are inevitable. While you could argue that so much interspecies conflict arising after the Reaper War demeans the whole point of Shepard's story, I think the opposite. I think it's a great place to build something of a thematic scaffolding that branches off the Mass Effect trilogy while remaining unique to itself. Furthermore, all these proposed points of conflict arise from Shepard's choices, the race's conduct during the war, and their history before it. You know, the details. It also allows the creators of the next Mass Effect to accomplish two vitally important steps for their sequel story, resetting both the storytelling style and its narrative stakes. Kicking galactic civilization in the teeth lets the writers take a step back and re-examine everything that made Mass Effect Mass Effect. They tried this with Andromeda, but we all know how that went. While it presented players with a new galaxy to see and some planets to walk around on as a token effort to feel like the first game, Andromeda's methods of storytelling and exploration were firmly couched in the style of the latter games, which is to say, again, literally antithetical. Another appealing aspect of Mass Effect 1 was its understated presentation, despite the cinematic injections made to the classic RPG formula. It didn't get flashy and bombastic until the last act of the game, when it earned it. You know, as opposed to the first 5 minutes of every other game in the series. There was a proper escalation of tension and stakes. If you want to properly reboot the franchise, again, you have to reset the stakes, start off on a more grounded foot. And in terms of stakes, you really can't get much higher than ancient genocidal robots that wipe sentient life from the galaxy every 50,000 years. While the Reapers were integral to the story told in the trilogy, I don't think they're necessary to tell a Mass Effect story. Neither is fucking Cerberus. Sorry. I do have some ideas about what the story for a new Mass Effect could look like. In fact, the original copy of the script had 6,000 words of just that, but that's just even more self-indulgent fanfiction. A reboot set in the Milky Way could really be about any number of things. The universe was built from day one to be a place where any sort of story could happen. I obviously have a preferred direction, but whatever it is we end up with, I hope it cares as much about the details as I do. But being details first doesn't stop at the writing, the dialogue, the characters, or even the lore. It extends to the gameplay as well, the interaction between the player and the game. As the series marched on, most of the traditional RPG fussiness was sidelined in favor of slick cinematic action and simplistic leveling. If we're making a sequel that lives up to Mass Effect 1, you bet your goddamn butt that the gameplay's gotta change too. As you may have noticed in the first section of this essay, I glossed over Mass Effect 1's flaws. not because I think there aren't any, but rather that they're largely gameplay related, and it'd be more fitting to discuss them here, all while allowing me to offer unhelpful solutions that are probably ludicrously difficult to code and expensive to produce. Also, take all this with a grain of salt, as it should be apparently obvious by now that I'm not a real game designer. Me, armchair. We all know by now that the combat for Mass Effect 1 had some issues, as did its leveling and oh, Jesus, the loot. It missed the mark in quite a few areas, but I think that the violent culling of traditional RPG features that began in Mass Effect 2 should be walked back a little. That's a lot of whining to unpack all at once, so I'll start with one of Mass Effect's primary gameplay features, the golden gun that sold the series, the dialogue wheel. There's been countless innovations and improvements made to the system across the medium since its introduction, and I'd like to explore a few iterations that would greatly enhance one of Mass Effect's most defining features. As I've stressed, dialogue and conversation are vitally important parts of the Mass Effect experience, and they fell to the wayside in the second game, before jumping off a cliff in the third. The gradual reduction of neutral options was disappointing, but the critical flaw was the disappearance of investigation trees. Even if the neutral options were usually just other dialogue lines wearing a hat, they gave the player a sense of agency, a sense that they were making a choice and defining who their shepherd was. It's a minor, fidgety detail, sure, but it's an important one for connecting players to their in-game avatar. However, the disappearance of investigation trees was a total fucking travesty. They were a core, fundamental part of the experience, integral to the unparalleled sense of exploration provided in Mass Effect 1. Without robust investigative options, the series became indistinguishable from countless other lazy, generic moral choice systems from any mid-2000s action game. Speaking of which, I think Andromeda's decision to abandon Paragon and Renegade was a good one, but I can't say I'm a fan of what they replaced it with. Besides appearing infrequently, mapping different responses to different personality aspects was an interesting idea, but still too constricting, and, like the Paragade system, often contradictory. I think assigning any kind of value to dialogue choices, other than their effects on the story and NPCs, is ultimately an exercise in futility. It's simply more engaging to have dialogue choices stand for themselves, and let the players debate what's right and wrong. In order to avoid confusion, however, we could keep a similar system to Mass Effect 1. Let me demonstrate. The left half of the wheel is used for investigation, where the player character can ask questions or request clarification, while the right half of the wheel is used to pursue core dialogue, options that make decisions, advance the conversations, or end it. But instead of Paragon being mapped to the top, neutral to the middle, and Renegade to the bottom, I'd simply change that to positive, neutral, and negative. Before you throw your Todd tomatoes at me, let me explain. Instead of just having our player character have yes, no, and yes sarcastic options, I think it would greatly benefit the series to allow the player to expand or quantify exactly how their player character agrees or disagrees, something that could also be reactive to previous choices or gathered information. Perhaps choosing a certain background gives you special dialogue in certain situations or with specific characters. Maybe if you've done a quest for someone, you'll have expanded choices and dialogue, or they'll be more open to questions. If you have a bad reputation with a given group, members of said group probably won't want to engage with you. Let's do an example. Let's say the new player character is a Spectre. You're talking to a Krogan ambassador at the start of the game. The ambassador approaches you with a request to put in a good word with the council to consider inducting the first Krogan Spectre. When the conversation first begins, the characters exchange a greeting, and then the wheel pops up. On the investigative side, you get a chance to ask about what things are like on Tuchanka, ask personal questions about the ambassador, or what they think about the council or Rex. On the right side, you can progress the conversation by asking what the ambassador would like the player character to do. The ambassador will note to the player character that there currently aren't any Krogan Spectre candidates, which is where the system opens up. On the left, we'll have some clarifying questions, maybe why is that, or who would you recommend? On the right, we'll give the player a set of options to progress the conversation with a little indicator to show that choosing the option will open up the aforementioned quantifying statements. Expressing support opens up a few choices, with the defaults being the Krogan have earned it or it would be a powerful gesture. However, if the player picked a certain background, perhaps they can mention that they personally served with Krogan during the Reaper War and will vouch for a candidate on a more personal level. On the other hand, the player could ask the ambassador to be patient, with expanded options to either say that the timing isn't good or that Krogan simply aren't capable of being Spectres. So instead of encountering a similar situation to Renegade Shepard ping-ponging between Ruthless Pragmatist and Ku Klux Shanksy, the player has the option of making their character a major space racist, but also allows them to support dickish opinions and decisions with more reasonable explanations. Maybe you can use the same served with Krogan background to say that the Krogan are good in combat, but might come up short on the investigative aspect of being a Spectre. You know, rationalize your space racism. This conversation system would help players connect with their character more intimately while rewarding exploration, investigation, and engagement with the game. I realize this would be difficult and expensive to accomplish, but I think it's doable as long as these expanded options are offered in more important conversations, such as character-defining dialogues with squadmates, moral quandaries, or decisive story beats. Even if there's usually just two different ways to agree or disagree, I think this would go a long way to help players connect with their character. It would also be limited to core dialogue options, the right side of the wheel, as giving players different ways to ask the same questions would unleash a fractal fucking of extra work and expense that doesn't serve any utility. However, giving players special questions, prompts, and responses that they've earned through completing quests or investigations could be a good way to reward player exploration while encouraging replayability. There wouldn't need to be more than a few dozen of these, honestly. Mass Effect games are huge, and it doesn't need to be as in-depth as something like Disco Elysium or the original computer RPGs. It's just an iteration on Mass Effect's defining feature. Speaking of conversations, I want to make a quick aside and praise Andromeda for the incidental banter between squad members during exploration. These contain some of the game's better writing, and it was sorely missing from the earlier games. Say what you will about the game as a whole, I think these were an unquestionable upgrade to the franchise, and they absolutely need to make a return. It's also not really necessary to have dialogue choices in these moments, especially if they're conversations between squad mates. Back to more interactive gameplay talks. Since conversation ties heavily into decision making, I'll take this opportunity to talk about decisions in the Mass Effect franchise and how they could be improved going forward. Decisions are one of the most important parts of Mass Effect, and definitely one of its most heavily marketed aspects. However, the game's tied decision-making too tightly to the conversation wheel. One of the most interesting choices of Mass Effect 1 was choosing to use disabling grenades on the infected colonists in Zhu's Hope. Although it's stupidly easy to just gun them down, using your limited number of gas grenades to knock them out is much more challenging. It's also a choice that has consequences later. Although I'm racking my brain, I can't think of too many other instances in the series where combat or non-dialogue gameplay is used to make a decision. That doesn't count. I realize this is difficult to accomplish, but I think a couple instances of similar decision-making processes would help keep players on edge and teach them that actions have consequences. As a brief example, perhaps a player is given a mission to wipe out a hidden terrorist compound. You know, the quest from every Ubisoft game ever. Without thinking, the player could just roll up to the compound, exterminate everyone inside with extreme prejudice Spetsnaz style, and then jet back for the reward. However, if the player does some investigation or careful analysis of the presented information, they might realize that the people in the compound aren't terrorists at all, and they were being set up by the quest giver. The player instead peacefully approaches the compound and disarms the situation via dialogue, or learns some information that adds a new twist to the quest. This was also a problem with Mass Effect 1. For such a rich, textured, and detailed world, there really weren't too many instances where a non-dialogue based quest could be resolved peacefully. It's a problem across the entire ARPG genre, really, and refocusing Mass Effect's quest design to be less Fallout 4 and more Kingdom Come Deliverance would be a fan-fucking-tastic way to innovate. Speaking of innovation, this is a nice place to segue into the more radical gameplay changes I'd like to discuss, namely those regarding combat. In Mass Effect, combat underwent tremendous changes between each game, with the general consensus being that it improved with each iteration. I mostly concur, but I'd like to talk about how it could really shine. The combat across the Mass Effect games is much more limited than you might think, even taking Andromeda's power sets and jetpacks into consideration. In every game, combat situations are approached in the exact same way with very little variation. Show up, shoot the bad dudes until they all fall down, wait for their reinforcements, rinse, repeat, done. To put it pretentiously, the verbs were many, but the sentence was always the same. Combat is treated like an obstacle. Rarely is it presented as an actual choice or problem-solving method. I understand that as action RPGs, the Mass Effect games necessitated lots of shooting. I just don't think it should be applied so constantly and framed so repetitively. Introducing a few twists to this formula could help expand Mass Effect's world and help players realize that it's a living, breathing place. Approaching combat the same way every time isn't just not ideal, it's also boring. Consider Metro Exodus. Though a minor example, it represents what I'm talking about perfectly. Sometimes, human enemies surrender once they realize they're completely outmatched. This small touch immerses players in the world, and although they know deep down that this dude is just a bunch of pixels, he's behaving like a real person, and they should treat him like one. Adding something like this to Mass Effect would be a great addition to sentient enemies, a detail that would also reward critical thinking. For instance, mercenaries, pirates, and isolated survivors of the Reaper War would be more ready to surrender, but brainwashed terrorists or cultists or whatever would never give up. So if the player thinks for a bit about the quest briefing they receive, pick up some context clues, or do some scouting, they can approach the upcoming battle in different ways and prepare accordingly. It's stealth. I'm talking about stealth. While I realize this is a big ask, I think it could help diversify the type of combat and interactions the player has access to. I don't think it has to be an extensive stealth system with body dragging and the like, and it definitely shouldn't be the mechanically superior option like in Skyrim or the new Deus Ex games. I realize that the choice between stealthing it up and going loud is the Dark Souls of making you feel like Spider-Man when it comes to gameplay modalities, but I think it helps connect Mass Effect's focus on choices to its gameplay, as well as all that stuff I said earlier about resetting the stakes. Shepard was a legendary figure, and whoever has to fill those shoes might not be as capable. Giving players the option to skulk around and thin out enemies before engaging in a firefight subconsciously informs them that this new character cannot steamroll entire enemy divisions like Shepard could, and that victories will be harder won, but more rewarding for that fact alone. This is what bearded, snobbish hipsters like myself would call ludonarrative harmony. A more novel choice for a big combat shakeup would be implementing environmental destruction into Mass Effect's combat, but this is a far more technically demanding inclusion, and unless it's properly integrated into the narrative, I'm not sure the gameplay benefits it brings would be cost-effective. Although I'd still love to see destruction, I think stealth is simply a more efficient way of introducing variety. And while you might think that the established existence of active camo would trivialize it, consider this. What if active camo was an equipment option? A choice that fundamentally changes the player's toolset and how they approach combat? Something like a jetpack. Jetpacks were one of the best parts about Mass Effect Andromeda's combat. Besides greatly improving the player's raw mobility, they made the combat environments more interesting to navigate. Plus, they were just fun. However, these jetpacks also fundamentally changed how the player interacted with the world and how they viewed their rider. Sure, it made combat more zippy and fast-paced and allowed for boring platforming sections, but it told the player something important. That Ryder is a superhero, which was only further reinforced with the character of Sam. This actively went against what the narrative was trying and failing to tell you. That Ryder's out of their depth, that they're new at this, and they're not a peerless veteran like Shepard. But they're a super special AI-enhanced 20-something with a jetpack, so they'll be fine, whatever, move on already. Stakes? Tension? What are those? This is what bearded, snobbish hipsters like myself would call ludonarrative dissonance. Personally, I'm divided if I'd like to see the return of the jetpack, but I think employing it as an option, say like active camo, or fortification, or reactive armor, or a heavy weapon hardpoint, or
Grappling hook!
yeah, would help foster the idea that the player can forge their own character and playstyle while also encouraging experimentation. Like, maybe a player enjoys stealth mechanics, but they notice they can use a jetpack to dash out of the way of a patrol, or access out of sight but harder to reach areas. Or maybe they don't care about stealth at all. They're a vanguard, goddammit, and they just want to punch everything and go really fucking fast. These choices all come about simply by adding stealth mechanics. Doing so would also make weapon selection and customization more interesting. Oh, and a brief note on weapons. Fuck thermal clips. Besides, lore-wise, being an unambiguous downgrade that was unilaterally applied to all weapons across the galaxy in the span of 2 years, they took away one of the most interesting things about Mass Effect's combat, making the guns feel mechanically identical to ones found in every other third-person shooter. Getting rid of them and reinstating the overheat system would also make sense lore-wise this time around, as all the very new and recently developed factories that produce these thermal clips would have been destroyed by the Reapers. All the clips and remaining stockpiles would be depleted by the time the war is over, never mind years later. But how does this tie into weapon customization? Well, think about the stealth we just talked about, and the quintessential weapon attachment, the suppressor. While installing one on your Carnifex would make it quiet, it would also rapidly build up heat, giving the player a tangible trade-off when they build their weapons. Maybe if you also installed an additional heatsink upgrade, you could circumvent this a bit, allowing you to burst down tougher enemies in stealth before switching weapons, giving the player even more options to consider while on a mission. There's substantially more you could do with weapon customization, but I think I've made my point. Now, I'm sure you've been thinking about it this whole time, but we should talk about Squadmates. Mass Effect companions are a staple of the franchise, if not the genre, but they fell into a weird place as the series marched on, before they were actively ruined in Andromeda, at least in terms of combat. I've already said how Shepard dying in Mass Effect 2 was basically the worst, but I'll elaborate it on a little more. In Mass Effect 1, Shepard wasn't some superhero or chosen one, merely an effective soldier and talented leader that was uniquely suited to the situation at hand. Cerberus bringing him back from fucking atmospheric re-entry, then turning him into a super extra special death machine not only broke the narrative, but it also marked a turning point in how the games treated companions. This is entirely anecdotal from my personal experience with the games, but it seemed that Squadmates saw a marked drop-off in combat utility as the series progressed, something that further undermined the narrative by taking all the stuff the story was saying about interspecies cooperation and working together and all that jazz and just fucking tossing it out the window. In Mass Effect 3, Shepard is unquestionably the most useful member of the squad, with the notable exception of a certain game-breaking Garrus build that changed him from a decent sniper to, well... Otherwise, playing on the difficulties that offer any sort of challenge means watching your allies get wiped in nearly every encounter. Or maybe I was just bad at builds. But this got objectively worse in Andromeda. You weren't allowed to dictate when squadmates used their powers or what weapons they used, and it subsequently sucked any sense of tactics out of the combat. Companions need to change that. How? First, let the player control squadmates' power usage again, combined with a straight upgrade in general combat effectiveness that's matched by increased enemy difficulty. Second, give the player more options to direct their squadmates. While it was a bit finicky in the original version of Mass Effect 1, the remaster vastly improved the functionality and responsiveness of squad commands. They're pretty simple: attack this target, take cover, move there, and rally up, but a Mass Effect game doesn't really need much more than that. Combined with some light combat chatter from the player character and their squadmates, and I do mean light, this could lead to some really dynamic and immersive firefights. Not only would these be fun to play, but they'd also help ground the player in Mass Effect's primary themes by highlighting the importance of communication and cooperation. Obviously, AI companions and stealth gameplay go together like toothpaste and orange juice, but a cop-out stay here or solo mode could make this a more viable option, with a quick rally up being all you need to have your teammates bail your clumsy ass out when you get caught. But what about the player character? What about all those powers and skills that made Mass Effect's combat click? How can you return Mass Effect to its roots when the first game's combat was so awkward and finicky? I think the best place to start is to examine the series' DNA as an RPG. While Mass Effect 1's leveling system was functional, it lacked oomph, for lack of a better word. Investing XP into weapon skills only incrementally improved their effectiveness, and some skills were blatantly more useful than others. The later games attempted to rectify this by tying character progression to combat powers and their efficacy. While the feel of combat and leveling improved as a result, it was like putting a band-aid on a sucking chest wound. Build diversity jumped off a cliff, and so did most of the other RPG aspects that made Mass Effect 1 so unique. This was made even worse in Andromeda. While Ryder's incredibly vast array of powers and flexibility when switching between them was fun and easy, there's an inherent problem with that. As discussed by Racevic in his Andromeda retrospective, there was never any reason to employ this system due to the sheer effectiveness of some powers, something that tossed the concept of replayability off a cliff. Why pick a different origin or approach combat from a different angle if all these angles just lead back to the same path? I think there's a few ways to fix this and improve upon Mass Effect 1's character progression, while integrating the better contributions of later games in the series. The first step is to once more return to the original classes. Kind of. It starts with character creation. Give the players the option to begin with training in one of 6 roles, one that grants a unique, unalterable power set. Then, allow them to pick a few additional power sets from a larger pool that's not bound to the role they chose. Powers they can later swap out for others as the game progresses, if they feel the need. The second step is to reintroduce weapon skills. While I can see the intent behind these in Mass Effect 1, it was their execution that was lacking. For example, a Shepard that wasn't a soldier or infiltrator basically developed Parkinson's whenever they scoped in with a sniper rifle, not to mention how accuracy penalties for weapons outside your class's proficiency absolutely destroyed any attempts at experimentation. This was done away with in the Legendary Edition, and the results speak for themselves. Now, you can use every weapon, but the game still encourages you to specialize. As for this theoretical sequel, it's not too hard to improve on weapon skills. Just cut down the maximum number of points a player can invest in them, then grant larger bonuses at certain checkpoints along each weapon path. This provides players with room for experimentation, while also giving them more options when their character approaches combat. The third step is to bring back more traditional RPG skills. We'll call these attributes. Persuade and Intimidate won't work without the Paragate system, so we'll combine them and call it Charisma instead. Conditioning can make a return here, allowing players who invest heavily into it act as a fast-moving, hard-hitting tank for the team. Maybe a stealth skill makes you harder to spot. I could go on, but you've seen this kind of thing before. This all sounds like a lot, but compared to some RPGs, it's pretty lean, and retains the spirit of the Mass Effect games. It's also pretty easy to divide into 3 tabs, making menu navigation and leveling straightforward. The ultimate point of making these changes is to reward experimentation and build diversity without sacrificing replayability. See, in Mass Effect 1, if you spent the whole game investing into a charisma skill, then you could redeem the main villain of the game. If you didn't max out Persuade or Intimidate, then it was impossible. Discovering this not only encouraged replayability, but reminded the player that their choices, even non-diegetic ones, are important. Something I'd like to see carried forward in the next Mass Effect. Okay, so I've finally reached the end. I realize that this was all a bit self-indulgent, and my non-existent game design experience probably doesn't help my arguments. The ideas I have would be incredibly difficult to tackle and implement, but still, I can't help but wonder what a worthy successor to Mass Effect 1's legacy would look like. As a franchise, Mass Effect is on the ropes. Despite the Legendary Edition bringing in some new fans and buffing out some scratches on the trilogy's finish, the unfortunate fact of the matter is that even a brilliant remaster is not enough to fix the franchise's core issues. It'll serve as a handy cash injection, but just like Botox, injections can only keep a corpse looking fresh for so long. Ultimately, I believe revitalizing Mass Effect 1's promise of a richly detailed science fiction RPG is what will save the series in the mind of its supporters. A true realization of that would be a strong return to form, not just hollow lip service. Whoever's in charge of the next installment, it's important that they look into the first game's lineage not just as a BioWare title, but as a piece of science fiction. As fans, it's important that we criticize the games constructively, and look forward to what the series can be, instead of wallowing in any failures it's had over its decade and a half of existence. I'll also be the first to say that my ideas and opinions aren't perfect or unique. They're not silver bullets. They just appeal to me personally. A handful of theories among countless others fans have crafted in the years spent waiting for news on one of our most beloved RPGs. Hell, I wrote this script in late 2019, and Mr. Beatong, who also posts to Seamus Young's 20-sided site, came up with many of the exact same bullet points, completely independently, in like mid-2020. If you get nothing else out of this glorified rant, I hope you at least start thinking about what you would like to see in a potential sequel. Really think about it. Don't just vomit up some bullshit listicle. Maybe you feel the need to take a look at the Legendary Edition. Maybe I've convinced you to go read Seamus Young's Mass Effect. Maybe do both. In any case, start thinking. It's what Mass Effect 1 had me do. This was my first ever video essay thing, so I really appreciate you sticking with me. I realize it might not have been the strongest one ever made, but I'm happy I got to talk about Mass Effect for nearly an hour, and I had fun putting it together. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this or want to hear more, let me know. I'd be happy to elaborate on some more Mass Effect stuff, or maybe talk about other games. I'd also be happy to answer any questions you have, whether in the comments or otherwise. I have a Discord you can check out, and a Twitter for short updates, with links in the description. I also stream my editing process and some shitty gameplay over on Twitch if you really want to chat or keep up to date. Whew, all done. Until next time.
We're bang, okay?